I remember the first time that I saw Dragon's Lair in an arcade, and I just stood in front of it. I wasn't even playing it. I was just listening to the attract screen, right? Dragon's Lair, when you get to control Dirk the Daring and whatever it was. It was absolutely amazing because here was a cartoon that looked just like all the cartoons I used to watch as a kid on Saturday morning, and it was a video game. It was a video game that was a cartoon that you control. Now, I'm not going to get into the play mechanics just yet, but just listen to that concept. It was a video game where when you put the quarter in and you hit that one player button, if you told the guy to go to the left, he went to the left if that was the right move. And if you hit the sword button when it was the right thing to do, it was. But if you didn't do the right move, it gave you another animation. It was essentially a cartoon video game. And a lot of people argue, well, you can't really control the cartoon. Who cares? Dude, I mean, the modern day cut screens are all built on Dragon's Lair. And by the way, even when you play a very complex game like Mortal Kombat 1, I'm talking about the brand new Mortal Kombat 1, MK1, not Mortal Kombat, the first one, but MK1. I mean, what are you really doing? You're hitting a sequence of buttons in order to look at an animation for a few seconds. What is the difference between that and Dragon's Lair? And by the way, Dragon's Lair was very linear, right? You start here and then you get to the end and then you have to save Princess Daphne. Okay, well, there's different pathways that the game would take. It would mirror certain images in certain stages. I'm getting way ahead of myself, but the main point is that as a kid looking at this thing in 1983, it is a cartoon that you can control. To put that into a video game was absolutely revolutionary, and I could not stop playing it. And by the way, it was double the price of every other video game, and rightfully so. It was 50 cents. And when people saw that, especially parents, they were like, I'm not going to pay 50 cents. It's like, well, first of all, you got to pay for everything. I'm only freaking 8 or 9 years old, so you got to pay for this. But I would sacrifice playing 2 games of Pac-Man just for 1 game of Dragon's Lair because I thought the animation was great. The sound was great. It was just an awesome machine and uniquely shaped, just like our previous adventure into the discovery of the Tron cabinet, which was unique. And so it stood out. It sounded good. It looked good. And it had features unlike any other video game. I loved playing Dragon's Lair as a kid. One of my top 3 video games of all time. Dragon's Lair. It was a laser disc. In 1983, when video games used simple pixelated graphics, Dragon's Lair introduced a brand new format, the animated video game based on a cartoon. Now, this was a laserdisc title. It became an arcade phenomenon blending traditional animation with interactive gameplay. Dragon's Lair began as a concept by Rick Dyer, president of Advanced Microcomputer Systems, later RDI Video Systems. He wanted to create an interactive animated experience. So the game became notable for its production team. I mean, they basically took game designers with animation backgrounds who were making movies, okay? He recruited former Disney animator Don Bluth, who everyone really should know. When you look up Dragon's Lair, you're going to see Don's name come up nonstop. And along with his partners, Gary Goldman and John Pomeroy. Now, Bluth and his studio produced 22 minutes of what's called cell animation. And cell animation made the game look like those classic Disney movies like Snow White and whatever else was out there, Fantasia. And so it looked incredible, right? So just to look at it as a kid, that was part of the draw. Now, how much did it cost to make this game? It was over $1 million, and it took 6 years to finally get it to production. Can you believe that? I had no idea it took 6 years. It was unbelievable. So all the creators collaborated. They had the core design, the player controls, Dirk the Daring, a knight, but not exactly the best knight, but that's okay because to me, he was kind of cool looking. And he had to save Princess Daphne from Singe the Dragon and the castle of the castle. Maybe he was canceled also. Maybe he said something bad that people didn't like. He was canceled. In the castle of the evil wizard Mordrak. I can't even say that name right. Wow, I'm so excited. I have no idea who the hell Mordrak is, but I guess that was his castle, right? I do remember Singe. I don't know who Mordrak is, but I guess we'll get to that a little more in a second. The gameplay consisted of QuickTime events. So basically, they were just little movies. Like I said before, you go to the left, you get to see what happens. You go to the right, you see what happens. So if you choose the right direction or you hit the sword at the right moment, then basically you get to the next animated screen. And if you don't, then you get an animated sequence that basically says you're dead. And after 3 tries, Dirk turns into a skull and bones and just crumbles. It's funny, whenever the parents reacted to that death screen, they were like, oh my God, that's too vulgar. It's too violent. And me, I was like, no, it's kind of cool. Because that's what kids look at things like. They look at things in terms of being cool. They don't care about, this hypersexuality or if something is too graphic or blood. They don't care about that. They just want to see something that's cool. Come on, guys, relax. Now, what's really funny about early video game technology is that they really did their best to try to bring it to the home. So, back then, what did you have? ColecoVision, and you had Atari, and of course, the Commodore 64, which was really a video game system disguised as a computer, but I got into that in some other video. And I love the Commodore 64, and that's why I loved it, because you could play video games on it. But, just basically taking any of those games from that era and trying to bring it to the home system was absolutely impossible. This one was literally impossible. First of all, it used a laser disc. That was unheard of. I mean, this is before people even cared about or even had access to, I believe, CDs. Like, CDs weren't even a thing that a consumer would be able to purchase back in 1983. As far back as I can remember, I don't remember CDs coming out until later, for like the music format. People were still using cassettes. And if anyone did have a CD or a laser disc, like, you were pretty much rich. That's it. You were rich and you lived in a castle. That's it. Kind of like Mordrock, but I digress. So it was literally impossible. There was no home gaming system that would ever be able to emulate this thing. And later on, they like tried, and I'll get into that. But so what they did was they made home versions that had the Dragon's Lair name that looked absolutely, completely nothing like Dragon's Lair. All right. The first one I can remember was ColecoVision. All right. So that was one of the earliest ones. Let me tell you something. There was no full motion video. It was just, it was obliterated. It was not even close to what you could think of. As a matter of fact, Dirk the Daring had no face in certain sequences. It was just like a white outline. It was very funny. If you move forward to 86, I had the Commodore 64 version. Now, this one, again, it was more like a side scroller, and they tried to mimic certain sequences. They got one absolutely correct. And it's the one where Dirk walks into a room, and there, it's like a long corridor. It's like a hallway. And there's like a black door to his left and to his right, and he has to move forward. And as he moves forward, there are these other black doors to his left and to his right. And they're open doors. They're not doors, but they're more like caverns, right? And so there's 3 caverns on the left, 3 caverns on the right, and then the one where he gets to escape to, because that's how the game was based. Like, you would be in a room, you had to figure it out, and then you had to get out of the room. Well, they really did a good job of trying to replicate that for the Commodore 64. It wasn't terrible. It was actually really good. And if you look at the old videos of the Commodore 64 and you compare it side by side to the video game, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Did it look like a cartoon? No, it looked nothing like a cartoon. But the feel of it was actually identical to the game sequence. That was the only one that they got right. And they did it on the Commodore 64, a machine at the time that was not supposed to be able to do that. Okay, so it was absolutely crazy. And if you flip the disc over, they gave you something called Escape from Singe's Castle, which was supposed to be a sequel, but it wasn't. It was just, a way for you to have 2 games in one. It was just an expansion of what Dragon's Lair really was anyway, so not that big of a deal. So you have to go all the way to the late 80s, early 90s to get to the next translation. And these are for the more advanced 16-bit systems like the Amiga 500 and the 1000, the Atari ST. And even back then, we used to call old computers, that didn't run on Windows, by the way. They ran on Microsoft DOS disk operating system. And they tried to do lower frame rates of the actual sequences. It did a good job, and I thought the Amiga one did an amazing job, but the sound wasn't there. I thought that the PC one was actually kind of fun, and I thought the Atari ST one looked and sounded like complete dog shit. But the one that I enjoyed the most was the Amiga 500 one. That one was actually pretty cool. So now, in the arcade, because of the popularity of Dragon's Lair, the first one, which came out in 83, 8 years later, in 91, they came out with Dragon's Lair 2, and they called it Time Warp. It wasn't a good game. And the reason why it wasn't a good game is because it forgot what made the first one so good. And what made the first Dragon's Lair so good is that it had a mystery to it, because the second that you hit the start button, you got this really eerie kind of view of the castle. It was like, a little bit diagonal, and all you heard was like a low whisper in the in the background. It was like, like some wolf howling in the distance, and then it slowly zoomed in, and you didn't know what the hell was going to happen, and it was very fun. Dragon's Lair 2, Time Warp, starts off with Dirk, I guess, he had a bunch of kids. I think he had like 12 kids or something. It's like Jesus Christ, the Last Supper or something, and he's sitting down with his now mother-in-law, and Daphne's not there, and they're all getting ready to eat, and for some reason, she takes like a rolling pin, and she starts going after him. Now, this is a video game that I'm describing. I don't want to play a video game where the first screen that I see is the guy that I'm controlling sitting down eating food with a bunch of kids trying to get away from his mother-in-law. I mean, don't we already have to deal with that shit in real life? And I was, I didn't have a mother-in-law at the time. I wasn't married. I was in fucking high school. But that's not what I wanted. I wanted Dragon's Lair 2. I wanted the revenge of fucking Singe. I wanted, Mordrock, right? But I wanted that in the very beginning of the game. I don't want to have to eventually get to this thing. And after you got out of that sequence, it was, it was a little bit different because they gave you the option of grabbing things. So like every now and then there'll be like, like a flashing knife or an arrow or something. And if you hit in that direction, it would kind of flash it, but nothing would happen. He would just say, and he would grab it, and then you would have to continue the sequence doing the predetermined joystick and button moves anyway. So that was just like a useless feature. I didn't understand that one. And then finally, when like you did get to, something that was moving a little bit faster and more, enjoyable, it wasn't that enjoyable because it was basically Alice in Wonderland. Like he starts having to deal with images that look like they came out of Alice in Wonderland, like talking and walking card decks and stuff. It was just a very bizarre video game. I hated it. I absolutely hated that game. But anyway, so, there wasn't really a need or a desire for them to port that version and bring it over to the home system. But by 93, the Sega Genesis was out and they had released the Sega CD. So they figured that they can do a pretty loyal translation of Dragon's Lair, the original Dragon's Lair. So 10 years after Dragon's Lair came out in the arcade, they tried to do a Sega CD version, I guess, because they figured, well, whatever, the Laserdisc and the CD at that time was going to have the same capacity. It looked like pure crap. And it sounded good because it had CD quality, sound formatting. But again, just the animation, terrible, overly pixelated, didn't look right, missing sequences, the colors were off. It looked absolutely horrible. And that was the same thing with the PC. They came out with a CD version and it was terrible. And one that isn't really mentioned too often is that the Amiga came out with something, I think it was called, what was it? The CD32, the Amiga CD32. It's something with a 32 on it, which is allegedly 32-bit, but that was also a lie. That one was okay, but it wasn't great. It actually sucked also. So why don't we just forget about that one? So now if we go back, if we move forward a little bit, another one that I'm not seeing listed, which is crazy to me, but there was something called the CDI. And like the CDI was, I believe it did play Laserdiscs. And I think that was the premise. I think it was put out by Panasonic. Again, purely from memory. I'm not looking at anything. I'm just remembering. And the reason, the selling point for that system, the reason why it even got any kind of sales is because they claimed that they were going to do a direct translation of Dragon's Lair from the original 83 Laserdisc to this one. They got close, but here's the problem. It looked much closer and much more faithful to the 1983 version. All right. So we had to wait like almost 20 years. So this was already in 2002. The problem is that the loading time on the CDI was atrocious. So you would play the game. It would look really cool. And then, you sort of saw that opening sequence I was telling you about. And then it was loading. Then you get to the one sequence, you play it. Okay, that was really fun. Now it's loading for another 15 to 20 seconds. 15 to 20 seconds doesn't sound like a long time, but if I didn't talk for 15 to 20 seconds, you'd be like, what happened to this guy? Did he like fall in his toilet or something? Like, did he get like swallowed up by another dimension? It was a really long time. And what I'm noticing about some of these modern Xbox Series X games is that they have these loading screens that they're distracting you by like playing music. Like even with Call of Duty 7, you're like sitting there waiting for something to happen and it's just loading in the background. It's telling you that it's doing a bunch of stuff like connecting to the network or logging you in, but really it's just loading the game in the background, giving you a bunch of bullshit words on the screen, which is, again, but anyway, I digress. Let's get back to the CDI. And so that was the problem with the CDI, and the controls were not great. So if you hit up, there was a slight delay. And the good thing about the arcade game is that if you hit up, the second you pressed up, you got what's called audible feedback. So you would hear like doot, doot. And if you hit the wrong button, then it would be like, which is basically taken directly out of game shows. So like, like let's say that you gave the wrong answer in the game show, then you hear the, and if you did the right thing, you would hear the ding. So that's pretty much what the original arcade did. This one attempted to do that. If I hit up, you wouldn't hear a damn thing, and then you would hear something, and then it would move. So there was a slight delay, but it was such a noticeable delay, it made the game unplayable. So that's the CDI version. Again, I don't see it mentioned here, which is absolutely crazy. And now I'm seeing something called Digital Leisure, and I think I remember this one. Oh, I totally remember this one. Okay. So they like released Dragon's Lair along with Space Ace, and this was on all the platforms. This was the PC, PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch. They also released something called the Dragon's Lair Trilogy, which was Dragon's Lair 1 and 2. And I think there was a third one released, but it wasn't popularized because it wasn't in arcade format. So I don't really consider that a legitimate sequel to the second one. But I do know that they released a trilogy that they called a trilogy, which was Dragon's Lair 1 and 2, along with Space Ace, which was another good one. And thankfully, they didn't do Space Ace 2 as far as I can remember. And if they did do Space Ace 2, I didn't care about it because if I saw it, I probably removed it permanently from my memory. Now, the problem with those translations, this Digital Leisure one, is it didn't look anything like the original arcade. Now, if Digital Leisure did a direct translation of the Laserdisc, I didn't see it because the version that I'm talking about was basically a side scroller. Dirk the Daring looked really good and he had the sword and he moved well, but again, there was like a delayed reaction. Like every time he jumped, it was like he was floating through the air. There was a later version, actually pretty recent, that was put out on the Xbox that was pretty fun fun to play, but it doesn't have the Dragon's Lair feel. And if anyone has a PC right now, or, you know, any kind of Windows based system, actually, if you have any kind of computer, then your best bet is to emulate it. There is an emulator out there that will play the game perfectly, along with Space Ace and Dragon's Lair 2 and all those other games that were based on the Laserdisc. But, you know, Dragon's Lair, the game itself, when I was a kid, that's a memory that I'm always going to treasure. And I love playing the emulator version because it is a direct translation of the video game. It is fantastic. But, you know, Dragon's Lair, it just has a history of adaptations. Like, you're talking about a company called Ruby Sears Enterprises. They had a animated television series that aired from 84 to 85. This is right around when Dragon's Lair was first released. There's also, believe it or not, in the works right now, allegedly, James Bobbin, he's the guy that did The Muppets, Dora and the Lost City of Gold. Allegedly, he's going to work with Ryan Reynolds, Deadpool, okay, to play the lead role of Dirk the Daring in a Dragon's Lair movie. And originally, I think they said they were going to release it on Netflix, but talks have been going on for the last 2.5 to 3 years now. I'm not really sure we're ever going to see that come to fruition. It would be a shame if it wasn't. But you talk about the perfect actor to play Dirk the Daring, it would be Ryan Reynolds. And it is Ryan Reynolds. And he's obviously was a fan of the video game, which is why he wants to do this project. I'm not too sure about the guy who made The Muppets or Dora the Lost City of Gold because I don't watch that shit. But I do know Ryan Reynolds is going to make sure it's going to be perfect because he was actually perfect in Deadpool, as everyone knows. And there was a movie called Free Guy, which is basically a modern version of Tron, done more like a love story, which was cringe, but he was great in it. And the premise was really good. And it does give you a lot of great references to the classic video games. But Dragon's Lair will always be one of the most fascinating video games to ever be released. You need to play the original version, get to an arcade, preferably the greatest arcade on earth, Galloping Ghost Arcade. And if not, go to your local arcade, support those people in your area because that is a piece of history that you get to experience. And if you're old enough, you get to go back to the arcade like me and be a kid again and put 25 cents, actually 50 cents. Well, now we got free play. But you can pretend that you're putting 2 quarters in to play as Dirk the Daring to save Daphne from the evil Singe in the castle of Dragon's Lair.